The largest gathering of people on the African continent is here, on this patchwork of islands and peninsulas on the coast of the Gulf of Guinea, Lagos. It's one of the 20 largest cities in the world, but it's also the second worst city to live in, only doing better than the capital of Syria, which is in the middle of a civil war. And a big part of why has to do with its geography and its early history. You see, the strange way in which Lagos is laid out, tangled between land and water, is an essential part of its soul. The first outside explorers said no one in their right minds would plan to build a big city on such an unusual configuration of lagoon and island. Yet, here Lagos stands 21 million people strong. How did it get here, and how did things get so bad? People say that the city just grew, driven by the circumstances of nature, politics, and business. So I want to talk about those circumstances, the ones that made Lagos one of the biggest cities in the world against all odds, how it became a great place to live, at least for a time, and the problems that it's facing today. The original inhabitants of Lagos are the descendants of a hunter from the heartland of the Yoruba people. They settled here in a town called Isheri. Then their chiefs moved to rule from a fishing village on the mainland at Ebute Metta. They called their leader Olofin, which means the perfect ruler. 12 descendants of this perfect ruler became known as the Idejo, or the White-Cap Chiefs. They are the custodians of the city's oral history, but their main authority comes from owning land. In the early days, Lagos was literally surrounded by huge empires, and they were always fighting with each other. They had Dahomey to the west, the Kingdom of Benin to the east, and the Oyo Empire to the north. Lagos shared a border with all of these empires, and the people were subject to raids from all directions. So they moved to this island, and one of the White-Cap Chiefs set up a fishing camp and a pepper farm here. They expected the lagoon to bring them safety. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. In the late 1500s, an armada of warboats from the Kingdom of Benin overran their settlement. At this point in time, the Kingdom of Benin was one of the greatest and most developed empires West Africa had ever seen. They went on to rule Lagos for 150 years. We can piece together what Lagos looked like at the time through the accounts of European merchants and explorers, and their maps. You can see the Lagos Lagoon on this Portuguese map from the late 15th century, but they don't show any towns or settlements here. This guy, the King of Portugal's personal squire, visited Lagos in 1485, and he said there was nothing there that they could make any money from other than slaves. So the Portuguese focused on other parts of Nigeria and Africa. They established relationships with Ijebu Ode, as well as the Kingdom of Benin proper, and Angola and the island of Sao Tome. But everything changed by the late 1700s. The King of Lagos invited the Portuguese slave traders to set up in the city. This was perfect because they had been excluded from the more popular slaving ports that were developed by the British, Dutch, and French further west along the coast. The coming of the slave trade made the rulers very rich. They had luxurious items from India and Europe, but they also had more power. With this power, they were able to exert an increasing amount of independence from the Kingdom of Benin, and Lagos almost became an independent city-state. Lagos also started to feel the impact of a lot of different international developments. The Sokoto Caliphate was taking over the future northern Nigeria, and this led to the collapse of the Oyo Empire. This collapse led to intensifying Yoruba wars, which increased the availability of slaves in Lagos. Around the same time, the French Revolution led to a campaign against the West African slave trade in France's colonies. For 10 years, the French naval squadron swept the coast of West Africa, arresting slavers and their ships. This made Lagos an even more important slave port. Napoleon re-established the slave trade 10 years later, but by then, the British government had outlawed slavery, so the Royal Navy West Africa Squadron took their place. Now, this was the peak of the Industrial Revolution in the Victorian era. Slavery was out and colonization was in. A lot of the history makes it sound like the British wanted to end slavery purely for altruistic reasons. Yes, the missionaries wanted to spread Christianity, and the violence required to capture slaves made that very difficult for them. But British merchants also wanted access to Nigeria's palm oil because they could make a lot of money selling it to factories back in England who used it as an industrial lubricant. Lucky for them, a political crisis was brewing, and they were definitely going to use it to their advantage. In 1841, Oba Akitoye had just been crowned king of Lagos, but his rival Kosoko, who was also his nephew, believed that he was the true king. In 1845, Kosoko forcefully removed Oba Akitoye and crowned himself king. Akitoye was in exile in Badagry, and he went to the British government with a proposition. He would ban slavery and let their merchants and missionaries in if they could put him back on the throne. So on Boxing Day in 1851, the British Navy showed up on the coast of Lagos with these huge warships. HMS Bloodhound, HMS Teaser, and a flotilla of small war boats surrounded the island. They engaged Oba Kosoko in a battle lasting 3 days. Half of Lagos was destroyed and Kosoko surrendered. Akitoye was installed as king and he swiftly signed a treaty ending the slave trade. Unfortunately, he died 2 years later and the British forced his son to sign this treaty, officially turning Lagos into a crown colony. So it's 1862 and England has finally added another colony to its rapidly growing empire. But what did they get? Well, shortly after the takeover, Sir Richard Burton visited Lagos and he said, "The site of the town is detestable. It's as if a hole has been hollowed out in the original mangrove forest and a town placed there." Mary Kingsley called Lagos a marvelous manifestation of the perversity of man coupled with the perversity of nature. They clearly had a lot of work to do, so the British quickly got to work on their new possession. They established the colonial government in the city's European quarters on Lagos Island. Businesses, suppliers, and contractors opened up nearby to service the administration, giving birth to the central business districts. The first colonial governor planted eucalyptus trees and he installed gas lamps all throughout the city. In the next 10 years, Lagos got the telegraph, the telephone, and they even got electricity before a lot of places in London had it. At the turn of the century, they built a railway from Lagos to the nearby town of Ibadan. They also began constructing the Carter Bridge, which was the first link between the island and the mainland. Now, pedestrians and the tram were going to be able to cross the lagoon for the first time. This guy, William McGregor, focused on health and sanitation reforms in the early 20th century. He built a massive waterworks here, 17 miles from Lagos on the Ogun River, and it brought piped water to the city and helped eradicate the disease, guinea worm. By 1911, visitors to Lagos described the city as a picturesque, congested town of 80,000 people. In this time frame, the British went on to conquer and unite the rest of Nigeria. Then, they made Lagos the capital. This is a map of Lagos from the 1950s. It shows that the structure of the city remained the same until the end of the colonial era. You can see the addition of more government buildings on the island like the Supreme Court and the House of Representatives. So, against all odds, the detestable site on an island surrounded by mangrove forests could now be described as picturesque. A beautiful environment that featured Portuguese, Brazilian, and British Victorian architecture. The streets were clean and lined with trees, and urban crime was virtually non-existent. So how did we go from this to this? Well, on October 1st, 1960, Nigeria gained its independence from the British. At the time, Nigeria had a population of 43 million people and Lagos had a population of 200,000. Nigeria's population is now 5 times larger, but there are 100 times more people in Lagos today than there was 60 years ago. This chart shows that the nominal GDP per capita in Lagos is about $6,600, which is double the national figure, and it would make Lagos one of the 5 largest economies in Africa if it was a country. Every month, close to 20,000 people arrive from poorer parts of the country and continent, attracted by an economy that's bigger than Ethiopia's. And this went on for decades. As you would expect, the rapid urbanization led to every problem associated with human beings in an urban environment. There was not enough mass transit, open space, housing, or infrastructure, and slums and squatter settlements popped up all over the city. Even if the government was doing all of the right things, it would have struggled to keep up with the pace of population growth. But the government was definitely not doing all of the right things. You see, after independence, Nigeria fell under the control of a succession of military dictators. So there wasn't any planning. Laws were simply made by decree. And the military was more concerned with fighting their opposition and rewarding their supporters than governing the country. The largest public park in Lagos, a 10-hectare park in Ikoyi, was sold as residential development land for the generals and their cronies to make a tidy profit. The waterfront here of the Lagos Cowrie Creek in VI was also sold for commercial development, which blocked direct public access to the waters and a picturesque view of Ikoyi. Zoning collapsed all over the city and shops and businesses opened in converted houses in the middle of residential neighborhoods. They failed to make the necessary infrastructure investments that a fast-growing population needs, and the city was pretty much left to its own devices in terms of services and money. By the 1990s, Lagos had become the ultimate dysfunctional city, and it was run as if there was no government because the military had no accountability. They eventually left their mess behind and moved the capital to Abuja in 1992. The military's failure to invest is the root cause of a lot of the city's problems today. For example, you have a situation where citizens can't get clean water in a city that is surrounded by fresh water. This table shows the population growth in Lagos and the available water supply over time. The total demand for water stands at 540 million gallons per day, but the state only has a total installed capacity of 210 million gallons per day. This means that only a third of the population is covered by the state's water corporation, and 50% of the population can't get any clean water. The government also failed to regulate local companies who contaminated the Lagos lagoon with heavy metals. There are large amounts of lead, chromium, nickel, and copper in water samples as well as in the fish. The lagoon has become so toxic that Lagos gets the majority of its water from out of state through the Ogun River. Fixing this issue will probably cost the government $2.5 billion, which is double its entire yearly budget. And this is just one of the city's many problems. Another is the city's lack of sanitation infrastructure. Lagos generates around 15,000 metric tons of waste every single day, which is enough to fill over 500 20-foot shipping containers. All of this waste goes uncollected and finds its way to the sidewalks, open spaces, and of course, the Lagos Lagoon. The waste disposal problem in Lagos exposes how important planning people is, as well as planning infrastructure. This video was taken just last month, and it shows residents dumping their trash in the middle of the streets, which is completely flooded. It's been over 100 years since Mary Kingsley said that Lagos is a marvelous manifestation of the perversity of man coupled with the perversity of nature, but it still rings true today. Even if the government somehow cleaned all the litter, built a waste disposal system, and put trash cans everywhere, it's not certain that people would stop littering. Urban planning in developing countries is as much about planning people as it is about planning infrastructure. The state needs to figure out how to deal with the people, especially the millions of poor people in the city, and not just how to organize the urban spaces that they occupy. But they failed to do either. So that's how this uninhabitable place became the most populous city in Africa, and it went from being described as heaven on earth at one point to now being worse than literal war zones. Over the past 15 years, the authorities have succeeded in raising more taxes and using money to restore basic infrastructure and expand public services. They've also made some decent progress on the metro system in order to improve mass transit. The Lagos Blue Line was opened last year and it shuttles thousands of passengers per day. But given the decades of neglect, the government is going to be stuck playing catch-up for a long time. Several studies predict that there'll be over 40 million people living here by 2050, making it one of the 5 largest cities in the world and putting more strain on its struggling infrastructure. As the population continues to grow, Lagos's problems are going to become more complex. Planning people, planning spaces, and fighting the fact that the city is sinking twice as fast as the global average city is a lot. Is Lagos going to make it, and what will it look like if it does?